The flag, the boat, and the warning sticker. I never imagined the same boat I served aboard during my 15 years of active Navy duty would someday become the center of a suburban HOA firestorm. I had earned that patrol boat. She wasn't just a vessel. She was a floating symbol of service, sweat, sacrifice, and the kind of brotherhood you only form at sea during deployments you count in months, not days. When I retired, I bought the boat from a naval surplus auction, spent 2 years refurbishing her, and eventually trailered her onto my large lakefront property, completely within my rights under both county and state regulations. I even had a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife for using the vessel in local restoration patrols. But all that meant nothing to Karen Goddard, the HOA president of the Sunset Cove residential community, a name that always sounded like a resort brochure trying too hard. She saw the boat not as a piece of naval history or a veteran's cherished keepsake, but as an eyesore. Her words, not mine, and in classic HOA Karen fashion. She didn't start with a conversation. She started with a violation notice, plastered right onto the starboard side of my freshly waxed hull with what I later discovered was industrial strength adhesive. Not tape, adhesive. It took me 3 hours to get the damn thing off without damaging the paintwork. At first, I laughed. I figured it was a misunderstanding. Surely no one would have the audacity to fine a veteran for parking his own boat on his own land that he bought with his own blood, sweat, and military pension. But when I contacted the whole office, I was directed straight to Karen herself. No assistant, no red tape, just a smug voice on the other end of the line that said, "It's against community appearance guidelines. That military thing doesn't fit the aesthetic of Sunset Cove." I almost dropped the phone. "Military thing," I repeated, trying not to boil over. "That's a retired Navy patrol boat. She saw action in the Persian Gulf. She carried sailors home. Karen didn't miss a beat. And now it's violating code. You have 7 days to remove it or be fined $500 a day." I've dealt with pirates, insurgents, and tropical storms. I've seen missiles fired, felt the heat of a desert wind in a steel uniform, and spent nights floating in dark water with nothing but the stars above. But never in all that time had I encountered someone so detached from reality and decency. As Karen Goddard, I took a breath. "Karen, this is private property. There are no HOA bylaws that prohibit boats on lots this size, and I have the state permit." She cut me off. "That will be for the board to decide." And that was the beginning. The first week, I got hit with 2 more violations, this time for improper flag display, because I had hoisted the Navy Jack and the American flag on the stern mast. Again, this was on my own property, but Karen claimed it violated height regulations. It didn't. I had checked the HOA bylaws the moment I moved in. I had even reviewed them again after the boat purchase. There were no restrictions about personal maritime vessels on lots over 1 acre, and no restrictions on flag height unless the flagpole exceeded 25 feet. Mine was 16. The next week, the letters started, thin, typed envelopes that smelled like printer toner and pettiness, each one more aggressive than the last. Threats of escalating fines, citations, a notice for a mandatory compliance hearing to be held in the Sunset Cove clubhouse, which I had never set foot in before, mostly because I had no patience for wine-tasting HOA socials and yoga for dogs classes. I attended the hearing out of principle. I wore my Navy dress blues the moment I walked into the room. Every board member's eyes locked on me like I was a bear that had wandered into a picnic. Karen sat at the head of the table, an expression like someone had just smelled sour milk. The rest of the board, 3 elderly retirees, and 1 noticeably nervous young couple, sat with notepads and bottled water in front of them. Pretending to be interested in procedure, Karen cleared her throat dramatically. "Mr. Daniels, this hearing has been convened to address your non-compliance with Sunset Cove's aesthetic standards, specifically regarding the large military vessel parked on your property and the unauthorized signage affixed to it." "You mean the flag?" I asked calmly. Karen nodded. "Among other things, those are military service flags recognized under federal law." "Are you suggesting the HOA has jurisdiction above U.S. Code Title IV? There was a pause. The couple exchanged glances. One of the retirees blinked slowly like he was buffering. Karen's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Daniels. We don't need lawyers or legal code to know what's inappropriate for our community image. You're scaring residents. That boat looks threatening." "Scaring them how?" I leaned forward. "Because it's gray and not painted like a party barge. Because it's not a lake toy," she glared. "Because it's military." There. It was the truth. The quiet part said out loud. Over the next few weeks, it escalated further. Karen authorized a private towing company to come inspect the boat. Except the driver came with a low-grade flatbed, not even close to capable of moving a 37-foot naval vessel. I caught him in the act, snapping photos on his phone and looking around nervously like he knew what he was doing was borderline criminal. When I confronted him, he said, "Just doing what the HOA told me to do." I contacted a lawyer. He was a friend from my veterans advocacy group and had dealt with HOA cases before. "The smells like discrimination," he said. "Targeting a decorated veteran, issuing false fines, and trying to remove personal property from private land. They're walking on a legal landmine." We filed a cease and desist letter. Karen ignored it. The fines increased, $500 a day, then a flat $10,000 remediation fee. That's when I went nuclear, not in anger, but in documentation. I began compiling every violation, every letter, every voicemail, every recorded conversation. I submitted a FOIA request to get Karen's communications with the board. What I found blew the lid off everything. She had filed false reports, claimed my boat was used for illegal harboring of individuals. Complete fiction. She had lied about state code violations that didn't exist. Worse, she had even contacted a local TV station anonymously, trying to frame the situation as a concerned neighborhood battling a dangerous veteran with PTSD and war gear. That's when it stopped being funny. That's when it got personal. I sat down with my lawyer. "We're filing a federal civil suit," he said. "Discrimination, defamation, and civil rights violations. And we're going after the HOA directly." The media storm and Karen's meltdown. By the time the sun rose the next day, I had already sent everything over to my lawyer. The voicemails where Karen's voice cracked as she accused me of weaponizing a war machine. The surveillance camera footage showing the HOA hired tow truck operator attempting to approach my boat without authorization. And most damning of all, the anonymous email sent to Channel 6 News from an account tied to Karen's personal WIF suggesting that a combat vet with unstable tendencies was harboring military-grade equipment in a civilian neighborhood. That last one was the spark that lit the powder keg. My lawyer, Paul Hadley, a former JAG attorney who didn't blink even when going toe-to-toe with big city HOA letters, knew we had something explosive. He filed a civil suit on the grounds of defamation, harassment, discrimination against a veteran, and violation of property rights, all underpinned by documented falsehoods and an orchestrated smear campaign designed to tarnish my reputation and bully me into submission. Within 48 hours, the local news team was on my front lawn. Channel 6 ran the teaser, "Veteran harassed by HOA over decorated patrol boat," alongside a shot of me standing with my arms crossed in front of the boat, the American flag rippling behind me like it had something to say to. The story exploded. By nightfall, I had interviews lined up with 2 national outlets. A retired admiral had tweeted in support, and hundreds of veterans and military families from across the country had begun flooding the HOA's Facebook page with fiery comments, calling out the injustice. My inbox was flooded with support. People who'd never met me were sharing their own HOA horror stories. Veterans who had also faced petty civilian power trippers after retirement, and neighbors from across town offering to help fight back. I had unknowingly become a symbol of standing firm when those in petty power tried to steamroll someone who had already given everything to protect their freedoms. Karen, on the other hand, was not taking it well. Her statements to the media were disastrous. First, she tried to play the victim, claiming she was just upholding community guidelines. But when reporters asked her which guidelines she was referring to, especially those that applied to private property owners with more than 1 acre, she stumbled. She changed her story 3 times in one interview. At one point, she said. We never knew the boat was legal, and in the same breath claimed. We asked him several times to remove it, but he was aggressive. That's when one of the reporters pulled out the voicemail recordings I had submitted. They played. Her voice, cold and authoritative, saying we don't want that war boat here. And this is a peaceful neighborhood, not a Navy base. There was no ambiguity. The veil was pulled back, and people saw the real Karen. The backlash was immediate. Residents began pulling out of the HOA meetings. A group of retired military officers who lived just outside Sunset Cove released a joint statement condemning the HOA's actions, calling them a disgrace to the values this country is built on. It reached the desks of local politicians. The mayor, a former Coast Guard officer, called me personally to offer his support and told me he'd be watching the case closely. Then, the real hammer dropped. A federal judge issued a temporary injunction halting all HOA fines against me and scheduled a hearing to assess the validity of the case and the HOA's internal enforcement practices. It was the first time I'd seen Karen completely speechless. I'll never forget the day of that court hearing. I didn't walk in wearing a suit. I wore my full Navy dress uniform again, not for theatrics, but because I needed people to remember what was actually being attacked here. It wasn't just about a boat. It was about service, dignity, and the line between authority and tyranny. Karen walked in surrounded by two lawyers paid for by HOA dues money from residents. She had used to fuel her ego-driven war. She looked pale, her usual confidence swallowed whole by the weight of actual legal consequences. Paul presented our case with precision, showing everything: timestamps, official permits, the military registration documents, and the explicit text of HOA bylaws that proved I was well within my rights. Then he played the recorded phone calls and the email headers showing Karen's involvement in the anonymous media smear campaign. The judge's eyebrows lifted multiple times. It was like watching a train slow-motion crash into a wall of facts. Karen's lawyers tried to argue that the HOA board had simply been misinformed, that they were operating on presumed violations, but the judge interrupted. So you're telling me you tried to tow a legal vessel from private property, levied tens of thousands of dollars in fines, and attempted to defame this man on public television because of a presumption? The courtroom went still. Karen's face turned crimson. The judge ruled immediately in my favor on the injunction, freezing all current and future HOA enforcement actions until the full trial. But the damage to Karen had already begun to spread. Multiple board members resigned after learning the full scope of what she'd done. The HOA's insurance company opened an internal investigation. One of the retirees who had sat on the hearing board with Karen went public and said they had been pressured to go along with her decisions under threat of being shamed at the next neighborhood social event. That's how far her control reached. She weaponized community pressure like a tyrant in a pantsuit. But she hadn't counted on someone like me, a man who had learned long ago to stand tall in the face of storms, a man who didn't bend because someone flashed a title or waved a clipboard. In the Navy, we learned that rank doesn't matter without respect, and Karen, she had lost that completely. The HOA tried one last move to save face. They offered to settle quietly. They proposed dropping all fines if I agreed to remove the boat within 30 days and sign a non-disclosure agreement. My lawyer laughed so hard I had to ask him to repeat what they said. I refused. I didn't come this far to fold. The story had already been told. Veterans groups were planning rallies. National coverage was still rolling. And then a whistleblower came forward from within the HOA management company. That's when things got even more interesting. The whistleblower, the financial audit, and the fallout. The early morning air still carried that faint summer dew when I received the call from my attorney, Paul Hadley, and from the tone in his voice, I knew this wasn't just an update. It was a warning shot across the bow. You're not going to believe what just came across my desk, he said. An internal whistleblower from the HOA management company reached out to us through our firm's veteran legal support inbox. Apparently, they've got documentation, banking records, board emails, reimbursement reports. The works. That sentence alone held more power than any courtroom argument we could have prepared. Because while Karen had taken things too far with her obsession over my patrol boat, This development opened a doorway into something far deeper and far more corrupt than simple abuse of HOA bylaws. This wasn't about appearances or property management anymore. This was about fraud, money laundering, and a decades-long abuse of position carried out right under the noses of hundreds of unsuspecting homeowners. The whistleblower, a young woman named Allison Grant, had been working in the financial compliance department of the HOA's contracted management firm for just under a year. She had joined fresh out of college, bright-eyed and ready to make a difference. But it didn't take long before she started noticing anomalies in reimbursement logs filed by the Sunset Cove HOA board, especially from Karen Goddard. There were irregular patterns, maintenance fees for landscaping that didn't exist, private travel expenses logged as board development retreats, and worst of all, HOA legal bills being paid from community improvement funds without homeowner consent or disclosure. Allison told Paul she had wanted to come forward sooner, but the company threatened legal action and termination if she went public. The only reason she broke silence now was because of the media firestorm surrounding my boat. My story had given her courage, and that in itself became the most unexpected silver lining of all. We arranged a private meeting. Allison brought a black duffel bag full of printed records, copies of expense reports, emails showing Karen authorizing unapproved withdrawals, and even a spreadsheet breaking down funds that had been siphoned from neighborhood events to pay for personal legal representation. One entry shocked me the most: reimbursement for unauthorized patrol vessel towing attempts, $3. $250, approved by K. Goddard. That's when it all clicked. Karen had not only tried to punish me publicly, she had tried to fund the entire ordeal with HOA money without even telling the board. She weaponized community funds to settle a personal vendetta. This wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Paul immediately called for a forensic audit through a court petition. We were granted one within 72 hours, thanks to the strength of our lawsuit and the mounting evidence Allison provided. The auditor assigned to the case, a grizzled former IRS fraud investigator named Kenneth Morrow, had seen every kind of deception imaginable from shell corporations to Ponzi schemes. But he told us during our initial sit-down, this one's personal. These people stole from neighbors, families. You can feel it in the paperwork. And I guarantee you this goes way beyond a boat. Over the next week, Morrow and his team combed through 5 years of HOA financials, and what they found left everyone stunned. Over $450,000 in misappropriated funds. The money had been funneled into various projects and consultations, but none had actually been carried out. There was a budget for a community center renovation that had never happened, landscaping contracts that were paid in full but left no invoice trail, security cameras that were purchased twice over but installed only once, and tucked into all of it were small but consistent reimbursements to Karen herself, often logged under ambiguous phrases like board wellness activities or community strategy sessions. One even listed a trip to the coast where she stayed in a 5-star hotel and billed it as neighborhood outreach. As the audit concluded, Paul prepared the bombshell brief for the civil court judge and copied in the state attorney general's office. This wasn't just about homeowner grievances anymore. This was theft, large-scale, long-running, and insidious. When word reached the HOA's legal counsel, they panicked. Suddenly, their tone changed. The same people who had once dismissed me as a troublemaker were now requesting mediation. They offered to drop all fines, issue a public apology, and even replace Karen at the next board election if we agreed to settle. But it was too late for settlements. The line had already been crossed, and there would be no return to quiet resolutions. In the meantime, Karen had completely disappeared from public view. The once smug and ever-present face of Sunset Cove's HOA was now nowhere to be found. Her social media accounts were deactivated, her LinkedIn removed, and according to neighbors, her blinds had stayed closed for days. But her absence didn't stop the momentum. The neighborhood turned on her. Residents demanded open meetings. They shouted down remaining board members and petitioned for a recall election. More homeowners began speaking out, not just about Karen, but about years of ignored maintenance requests, unreturned calls, and arbitrary fines. One elderly couple, Paul and Delilah Morgan, told a local reporter that they'd been fined nearly $900 for improper mailbox maintenance, even though they'd just repainted their box 2 weeks before the violation. Another man claimed Karen had threatened to sue him for visual pollution because his dog's kiddie pool was visible from the road. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the byproducts of unchecked power and a woman who had long ago begun believing her title gave her the right to control, shame, and extract value from her neighbor's dot. And then came the official summons. Karen was served with a civil suit not just from me, but from 3 other residents who had suffered financial or emotional damages at her hands. The total financial demand for $150,000, every cent of the misappropriated HOA funds. Her lawyers tried to argue that she was not individually responsible, that she had acted within the scope of her office, but the paper trail said otherwise. Every signature, every directive, every memo had her name. She couldn't escape it. What followed was the public reckoning. The final HOA meeting before the recall vote turned into a community uprising. Over 100 residents showed up, packed into the clubhouse and spilling out onto the sidewalks. News vans were parked along the road, and local law enforcement had been stationed nearby, just in case, as the remaining board members tried to call the meeting to order. Boos and jeers erupted. People demanded transparency. Some read statements. Others held signs with phrases like HOA or criminal syndicate, and Karen must go. And then, in the most ironic twist of all, Karen herself emerged. She tried to speak. She took the podium with her once iconic posture, arms folded, eyes stern, but the crowd wouldn't let her. Someone in the back shouted, "You stole from US." Another screamed, "You tried to ruin a veteran." And suddenly, the tide that Karen had ridden for years as queen of the cul-de-sac turned on her with a fury she couldn't control. Her voice faltered. She tried to explain herself. She blamed inadequate oversight and miscommunication, but the homeowners weren't buying it. The damage was done. She left that meeting with her head down, escorted out by a security guard paid for, ironically, with the very HOA dues she had misused. But this wasn't the end. This was just the crumbling of the throne. What came next would change Sunset Cove forever, and it would start with a trial, a full court-ordered audit, and the complete unraveling of Karen's fabricated empire. The trial that shook Sunset Cove. If someone had told me 6 months prior that my life as a retired Navy man would wind its way into a full-blown court battle against a suburban homeowners association, and that I'd be at the epicenter of a community-wide reckoning, I'd have laughed them off and gone back to restoring my patrol boat in peace. But now, as I sat in the courtroom on the opening day of the civil trial against Karen Goddard and the Sunset Cove HOA, it was no longer just about a violation sticker or even the boat itself. It was about accountability, truth, and whether people in positions of community power could trample on veterans and neighbors for the sake of personal ego and gain. The courtroom was packed to the brim. There were reporters with notepads flicking between pages, elderly neighbors clutching folded HOA meeting flyers like they were courtroom programs, and even members of local veteran groups in attendance. Their presence a silent but powerful message. Every seat was filled. The clerk had to bring in additional chairs from an overflow room. That's how much this case meant to the town. Paul, my lawyer, stood confidently beside me. He was prepared like a seasoned sailor charting a storm, organized, calm, and deadly precise. Across from us sat Karen and her new legal team, now different from the ones she had hired through the HOA dues before she was stripped of her position. These lawyers looked grim, already rattled by the audit findings and community outcry that had eroded their clients' credibility. Karen, for all her suburban ironclad resolve, now looked like a shadow of her former self. The once ever-smiling, clipboard-wielding neighborhood matriarch was pale, haggard, and visibly nervous, eyes darting around the room every few seconds as if looking for a friendly face that wasn't there. Not one of the HOA board members, not one community resident, and not even a hired PR rep came to her defense. She was, for the first time, alone. The judge, a stern but fair man named Judge Halverson, wasted no time getting into it from the outset. He made it clear this case wasn't going to be about personalities or neighborly squabbles. It was about the law, about truth, about whether authority had been misused under the shield of HOA governance. Paul opened with a statement that resonated so deeply that even the court reporter paused in awe. Before typing again, "Your Honor, this case is not simply about a veteran's boat or a disagreement over aesthetics. It's about a pattern, a dangerous precedent where a person entrusted with community leadership used that power to vilify, to defame, and to steal from the very people she was elected to serve. My client, a decorated Navy veteran, didn't just suffer unlawful fines, he was targeted with false allegations, media manipulation, and attempted financial ruin. And he wasn't alone. The evidence will show that this wasn't enforcement. It was a vendetta." Then came the witnesses. Allison Grant, the young whistleblower, took the stand first. She brought with her not just hard copies of financial records, but credibility. She had nothing to gain from her testimony, no lawsuit, no payout, no book deal, just a clean conscience. She detailed the irregularities she discovered while working under the HOA's management firm, how she was discouraged from asking too many questions, and how Karen had bypassed protocols to funnel money into unauthorized projects. The jury, composed of local citizens who knew both the neighborhood and the HOA culture well, listened attentively, eyebrows furrowing as the dollar amounts rolled in. Then came the moment that sealed Karen's fate in their eyes. Allison presented a set of emails, signed and time-stamped, where Karen explicitly approved a reimbursement for patrol vessel removal operations despite having no board vote, no contractor agreement, and no legal grounds. After that, Paul called in the forensic auditor, Kenneth Morrow, who walked the court through a timeline of financial abuse so clearly that even the most technical terms felt like headlines. He described how HOA dues had been siphoned into pet projects, personal travel, and inflated legal fees, all with Karen's approval or direct involvement. Morrow, a stoic man with decades of experience, paused only once during testimony, and that was to express personal disappointment. "In all my years of auditing, I've seen corporate fraud, tax evasion, and even non-profit laundering, but it hits differently when it's community funds, money from teachers, retirees, single parents being abused to punish someone who served this country." The courtroom fell silent for nearly 10 seconds. Karen's defense tried to mount a counter. They claimed she was misled by the management company. They argued she didn't have the expertise to interpret financial reports. They painted her as a well-meaning but overwhelmed volunteer. But no amount of sympathetic posturing could undo the damage. Not after the jury heard the voicemail of Karen telling me, in her own words, that my military thing didn't belong in a peaceful suburb, or saw the document trail showing she had tried to bypass state flag regulations by falsely submitting a zoning complaint under a different resident's name. That's when we introduced the nail in the coffin testimony from another HOA resident, a man named Charles Klinger, a retired firefighter, who had also been targeted by Karen for placing a fire department sticker on his front mailbox. She had fined him $150 and accused him of political messaging. His testimony made the court gasp. He said, "I realized then it wasn't just about boats or lawns or flags. It was about control." The trial lasted 5 days, each day a chapter in the unraveling of Karen's carefully built empire. By the time we reached closing arguments, the courtroom was emotionally exhausted, but determined. Paul summarized it best when he said, "Leadership, even at the neighborhood level, must be rooted in respect, not rooted in fear, lies, or personal vendettas." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. The court found in my favor, awarding full restitution of the $450,000 in misappropriated HOA funds, punitive damages for defamation and harassment, and court-mandated HOA reform. Karen was personally liable for $125,000 of it, with the rest to be reclaimed from the HOA's insurance under bad faith enforcement practices. The judge ordered Karen to attend ethics training, banned her from holding any HOA-related position for 10 years, and publicly scolded her for abusing her authority. As we walked out of the courtroom, the crowd of veterans, residents, and supporters stood and applauded, not just for me, but for the victory of truth over manipulation. I shook hands with people I'd never met. A little boy in a scout uniform saluted me. An elderly woman hugged Me and whispered, "Thank you for standing up." We all needed someone to do it. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about justice, it was about healing, about giving power back to the people who had silently suffered. Karen's house went up for sale a month later. Her name vanished from the neighborhood's Facebook page. A new board was elected, diverse, humble, and committed to fairness. The boat, she still rests proudly beside the lake, flags flying high, freshly polished, and more respected than ever. The HOA, they now host a yearly veteran appreciation picnic, something they never did before. And me, I finally sleep well again. Not because I won, but because I stood for something when it mattered most. From warship to watershed, the redemption of Sunset Cove, the storm had passed, but the echoes of its winds lingered long in Sunset Cove. Even after the judge's gavel fell and Karen Goddard's reign crumbled under the weight of her own misdeeds, the community didn't immediately return to normal. No, this wasn't the kind of conflict that left without leaving scars. People had suffered financially, emotionally, and socially. There were neighbors who had stopped speaking to one another over the HOA drama, friendships that had frayed under the pressure of fines and fear, and residents who had quietly endured years of silent oppression simply because they thought they were alone. But now, in the aftermath of a courtroom reckoning, the community had a chance, an opening to reshape not just its leadership, but its spirit. And ironically, the catalyst for that change was the very thing Karen had tried to erase: my patrol boat, that gray and blue vessel with its steel deck and weathered Navy numbers, no longer sat as an eyesore or threat as it had once been labeled by the HOA's petty crusaders. Now, people came by to admire it. Families walked there. Dogs passed my yard and paused to take pictures. Parents lifted their kids onto the trailer platform for snapshots, explaining that this was a real patrol boat used in naval operations, once crewed by heroes who kept sea lanes open and enemies at bay. Veterans from nearby towns began visiting, too, some quietly placing a hand on the hull as if greeting an old friend. Others brought their grandchildren, sharing stories they hadn't told in decades. For the first time since I parked her there, my patrol boat felt less like a relic of my past and more like a monument for the community's future. The new HOA board, freshly elected and unburdened by Karen's influence, reached out to me not with threats, but with curiosity and respect. The president, a soft-spoken school teacher named Regina Hollis, invited me to the next community meeting not to defend myself, but to speak. "We want to hear your story," she said on the phone. "Not just about the boat, but about what happened, how we got here, and how we can do better." That meeting turned into something more powerful than I expected. The clubhouse was full, not with pitchforks or angry voices, but with neighbors ready to listen. I shared my journey, not as a victim, but as a reminder that silence in the face of abuse, however small or local, is how power corrodes. I told them that I loved this neighborhood, and I wasn't here to fight it, I was here to protect it, just as I had protected my crew and country. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was honest, and in that room, something shifted. Soon after, the HOA bylaws were revisited. The community voted on revisions to the enforcement procedures, requiring that any future citation receive board consensus and offer residents a chance to correct or contest without immediate fines. A new financial oversight committee was formed, made up of accountants, retirees, and volunteers, none of whom held executive roles. Ensuring transparency, budgets were posted publicly, meeting minutes were distributed to every household, and perhaps most symbolically, the board asked if I'd allow the community to feature my boat in a newly planned Veterans Appreciation Weekend to be held each November around Veterans Day. The irony didn't escape me. The very vessel that had once sparked an HOA war would now become its centerpiece for peace. I agreed, of course, but not without making it count. I partnered with a local veterans nonprofit to organize an open house on my property for the event. We arranged for tours of the boat, educational sessions for kids about naval service, and a flag-raising ceremony led by a local JROTC unit. The turnout was overwhelming. Over 400 people showed up that weekend. The cul-de-sac turned into a parade route. My driveway became a footpath of respect. People brought food, shook hands, and introduced themselves with a sincerity I hadn't seen before in Sunset Cove. What had once been a fractured neighborhood was beginning to stitch itself back together. And Karen, she moved away quietly 2 months after the trial concluded. Her house was sold off-market to a young couple new to town, who were, thankfully, nothing like their predecessor. No one threw a farewell party. No one brought her cookies. No one hung a banner that read goodbye. She simply vanished, as if the community had exhaled her from its lungs. And while her legacy remained in the cautionary tales whispered on porches and over fences, she no longer held sway here. She was a chapter closed. What remained, though, was the aftermath, the subtle, often invisible work of rebuilding trust. I saw it in the neighbor who apologized for never defending me when Karen attacked, and in the former board member who offered to help repaint my mailbox as a gesture of goodwill. I saw it in the mother who asked if her son, inspired by the trial, could interview me for a school project about veterans and community leadership. And I saw it in myself, too, in the way I no longer walked out to the boat with wary eyes or tightened jaw. I walked with peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I knew the worst had been faced and overcome. The HOA itself changed. Where once it had been an invisible hand slapping citations onto fences and porches, it now became what it was always supposed to be: a resource, a help. The board launched a newsletter that included community milestones, birthdays, anniversaries. A community garden initiative began on the unused west lot. Children's art contests were held, with winners' drawings featured on the newsletter cover. Things that once seemed impossible in the shadow of Karen's rule were now blooming. The HOA was no longer a name that inspired dread, but something people were slowly, cautiously proud to be part of. One spring morning, months after the court case, I sat by the edge of my property with a cup of coffee, staring at the reflection of my patrol boat in the lake. The water was calm, birds chirped in the trees, and the American flag above the boat fluttered gently in the breeze. A neighbor jogged by and waved. Another drove past, honking once with a thumbs up out the window. It struck me then how something so small, a sticker, a boat, a misunderstanding, had unearthed something so big. Not just corruption, not just ego, but the silent compliance of a neighborhood too afraid to question. And yet, from that exposure came something rare and valuable: redemption. Not just mine, but everyone's. In the military, we learned that chaos doesn't build character, it reveals it. And Sunset Cove, through all the chaos, had revealed more than just who Karen Goddard was. It had revealed who we were, who we could become, and that, in the end, was worth every sleepless night, every courtroom battle, and every ounce of strength it took to stand up and say, enough. Legacy of the boat that wouldn't move. Time has a strange way of softening even the hardest memories. But there are some moments that remain sharp, not because of the pain they brought, but because of the change they sparked. In the year that followed Karen Goddard's downfall and the $450,000 reckoning that brought the Sunset Cove HOA to its knees, something extraordinary happened. Not overnight, not with dramatic headlines or late-night news specials, but with slow, steady acts of reconciliation, restoration, and reflection. I had lived long enough to see battles on the open ocean, to lose friends to both war and peace, and to stand in the face of injustice that didn't wear a uniform. But never did I think the greatest fight for dignity I'd face would unfold just outside my own garage, in the quiet, seemingly mundane world of homeowner politics. Yet, here we were, changed. The transformation of Sunset Cove wasn't marked by any grand celebration or sudden epiphany. Rather, it came like spring after a hard winter, unassuming at first, then unmistakable, one by one. The remnants of fear and control that had hovered over the community, like a gray sky, began to dissipate. Where once neighbors kept their heads down and avoided HOA scrutiny, now they smiled at board members who walked door to door for feedback. Where once a minor infraction could bring a threatening letter, now came friendly reminders followed by offers to help. The board, humbled and restructured, didn't just take power back, they gave it away, evenly, to the people who lived here, allowing Sunset Cove to become more than just a collection of properties. It became a shared space, one that actually felt like a home. The new bylaws, drafted with community input and approved in a record-setting vote. Included clause is ensuring no veteran, first responder, or public servant would be cited or penalized for the respectful display of symbols tied to their service. The board went further, launching an HOA education initiative that helped new residents understand the rules, not to punish them, but to include them for the first time. The HOA operated with the heart of the people in mind and not the insecurities of a single leader bent on dominance. The memories of Karen lingered, yes, but more as a moral compass than a scar. She had become a symbol not of leadership, but of what happens when power forgets its purpose. As for me, I settled into a peace I hadn't known since the day I hung up my uniform. My patrol boat, lovingly referred to by neighbors now as the Guardian, remained parked in its place, polished, respected, and proudly displayed. But more than just a piece of history, it had become a landmark, the centerpiece of school field trips, family stories, and HOA reform meetings. A bronze plaque was installed beside it, not at my request, but at the community's. It read, "In honor of all who served and stood their ground here and abroad. Let this vessel remind us that freedom, even in neighborhoods, must be defended with courage." There wasn't a day that went by when someone didn't stop to take a look, to admire, to remember. And I was always happy to share a story, not for the attention, but because stories matter. Stories shape the way we understand the world and the battles worth fighting. The impact rippled outward. Other HOA letters in the county reached out to ours for guidance on transparency and leadership. Local reporters began writing stories about reform rather than conflict. Veteran organizations contacted me for speaking engagements, asking if I'd talk about how to assert property rights with dignity, how to navigate civilian disputes with calm strength. I did, not because I liked the spotlight, but because I believed someone out there like me needed to hear that it was okay to say no, even to people who claim authority, especially to them. But the most unexpected reward came on a quiet Sunday morning, a year and 2 months to the day after the trial ended. I was working on revarnishing the boat's side railings when a young boy and his father walked up the driveway. The boy wore a faded navy cap, far too large for his head, and clutched a drawing in his hand. The father, tall and quiet, had tears welling in his eyes. "Sir," he said, voice shaking slightly, "my son chose you for his hero project at school. He wanted to draw a veteran who didn't just fight overseas, but who stood up for what was right here at home." The boy handed me the drawing crayon lines of my boat, the flag waving, and me standing tall in front of it, with a caption that said, "Mr. Walker, the veteran who made our neighborhood safe." I was stunned, not by the art or even the compliment, but by what it meant that our fight, every painful, grueling step of it, had planted seeds that would outgrow us all. Not all battles end in victory. Not all storms pass without loss, but some fights, especially the ones that start small, over things like lawn signs, parking disputes, or misunderstood flags, can become something far more important. When truth is pursued with patience, and when people refuse to stay quiet just because the opposition is loud. I never set out to be a community figure, and certainly not a symbol. I just wanted to park my patrol boat, honor my service, and live in peace. But life doesn't always give us quiet. Sometimes it gives us noise, and just disruptive noise. And when it does, we have to choices: retreat or respond. I responded, and because of that, a neighborhood changed. A corrupt system was exposed, and people, ordinary, everyday people, began to realize they had more power than any bylaw could ever limit. They just needed someone to show them how to use it. To this day, whenever I hear the soft flap of the flag above the Guardian, or watch a neighbor stroll past with a friendly wave, or see a kid pressing their nose against the window just to catch a glimpse of the boat that beat the HOA, I'm reminded that sometimes the loudest victories don't come with gunfire or headlines. Sometimes they come with a moment of silence and a boat that simply never moved.